He reached for the door of his car, then heard a voice that would change everything. It began on an ordinary afternoon. A billionaire CEO, Harrison Blackwood, reached for the door of his Bentley when a piercing cry shattered the calm. "Don't get in the car." The voice was small, trembling, but urgent. A maid's daughter, no older than 11, stood shaking with fear, her eyes fixed on him. Within minutes, Harrison's world tilted. A child he had never noticed spoke of danger he couldn't see, and of a name he thought was buried in the past. What she revealed would not only save his life, it would expose a secret that powerful men had killed to protect. And this was only the beginning. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. Don't get in the car. The words, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the quiet hum of the afternoon. Harrison Blackwood froze. His hand, already reaching for the gleaming chrome handle of his Bentley, stopped midair. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The scent of polished leather and expensive cologne, the low thrum of the city above, the respectful silence of his driver, it all evaporated, leaving only that one piercing cry. His security guard, a man built like a mountain, moved instantly. He pivoted on the balls of his feet, his hand instinctively going to the inside of his jacket. His eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the concrete expanse, searching for the source of the disruption. And there she was, a slip of a girl, no older than 11, with a cascade of blonde hair that seemed to catch the dim light and hold it captive. She stood near a service elevator, her small body trembling, her face pale with a terror that seemed far too large for her small frame. Her eyes, wide and blue, were locked on him, pleading. "Don't get in," she repeated, her voice a little more than a ragged whisper now. "Please, you can't." Harrison's shock quickly curdled into a familiar, icy irritation. He was already running late. A meeting with the board of trustees, a multi-billion-dollar merger on the line. This was an unacceptable breach of his meticulously scheduled life. "Thompson," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Handle this." Thompson, his security guard, was already moving. He crossed the distance to the girl in 3 long strides, his large frame dwarfing her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall of intimidation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You need to leave. Now." "No," the girl insisted, her eyes still fixed on Harrison. "You have to listen. It's not safe." The word hung in the air, a dissonant chord in the symphony of Harrison's ordered world. Safe. In his life, safe was a given, a non-negotiable, a concept managed by teams of experts and layers of security. To hear it questioned by a child in a parking garage was ludicrous. "Thompson," Harrison repeated, a sharper edge to his voice. "Get her out of here." Thompson reached out to gently take the girl's arm, but she flinched away, a small gasp escaping her lips. "I'm telling you, it's not right. The brakes, they're not right." Harrison's jaw tightened. The brakes? This was a brand new, custom-built Bentley. It was inspected weekly. The girl was clearly delusional. Or worse, a pawn in some elaborate, ridiculous prank. "That's enough," Harrison said, his patience finally snapping. "Young lady, I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but you are about to be in a great deal of trouble." He took a step towards her, his eyes cold with anger. The girl didn't back down. Instead, she took a shaky breath, her small chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. "My name is Abigail," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "And my mother is Susan. She cleans your office." Harrison stopped. "Susan?" He vaguely recalled a quiet, efficient woman who moved through his penthouse office like a ghost, leaving everything spotless in her wake. He'd never really looked at her, never learned her last name. She was just the maid. "And what does that have to do with anything?" he asked, though some of the fire had gone out of his voice. "She told me to watch out for you," Abigail said, her eyes welling with tears. "She said you were a good man, even if you didn't always show it. And she said my Grandpa Joe would have liked you." The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Grandpa Joe. It couldn't be. He stared at the girl, really looked at her for the first time. The blonde hair, the blue eyes, the determined set of her jaw. It was like seeing a ghost from a half-forgotten dream. Your grandfather," he stammered, his voice suddenly hoarse. Was his name Joseph Miller? Abigail's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, she whispered. How did you know? Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. He leaned against the cool metal of the car, his legs suddenly unsteady. Joseph Miller, his mentor, the man who had saved his life in the desert all those years ago. The legendary war veteran who had taught him everything he knew about honor, courage, and sacrifice. Thompson, Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper. Get the car checked. Now. Full diagnostics. And get Abigail and her mother up to my office. Immediately, he looked at the small, trembling girl who had just turned his world upside down. He didn't know how or why, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she had just saved his life. And he had a terrible feeling that he knew who might have wanted him dead. The merger, it was more contentious than he'd let on. There were people who stood to lose a great deal of money if it went through. People who might be desperate enough to do anything. An hour later, the verdict was in. The brake lines had been expertly tampered with. A slow, almost undetectable leak, designed to fail at high speed. The police were called. A quiet, internal investigation was launched, and the world outside Harrison Blackwood's orbit remained blissfully unaware. In his penthouse office, overlooking the sprawling city, Harrison sat in stunned silence. Across from him, Abigail sat on the edge of a plush leather couch, her small hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice. Her mother, Susan, stood nervously by her side, her face a mask of fear and confusion. He always said you were a good man, Susan said, her voice barely a whisper. My father, he talked about you all the time. He said you were like a son to him. Harrison looked at the photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and Joseph Miller, taken years ago. They were both grinning, covered in dust and sweat, the desert sun beating down on them. He had never known that Joseph had a daughter, or a granddaughter. He saved my life more than once, Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. It seems his family has a habit of doing that. He looked at Abigail, this small, brave girl who had faced down a powerful, angry man to deliver a warning. She had her grandfather's eyes, he realized. The same clear, honest gaze that saw the world for what it was, and wasn't afraid to speak the truth. He knew, in that moment, that his life had changed forever. The merger, the money, the power, it all seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered was the debt he owed to the man who had saved him and the family he had never known. A family that was now, inextricably, linked to his own. He would protect them, he vowed. He would find who was responsible for this, and he would make them pay. But more than that, he would honor the memory of his friend, his mentor, his hero. He would try to be the man that Joseph Miller had always believed him to be. And he would start by learning the name of the quiet, efficient woman who cleaned his office, and the brave, beautiful daughter who had saved his life. The silence in the penthouse office was thick with unspoken emotions. Harrison, a man accustomed to being in control, felt a profound sense of unease. He had built his empire on a foundation of logic, reason, and ruthless efficiency. But the events of the day had shattered that foundation, leaving him adrift in a sea of feelings he had long since suppressed. Gratitude, guilt, a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Susan, he began, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He had never addressed her by her first name before. I am deeply sorry. For everything. Susan just nodded, her eyes still wide with a mixture of fear and relief. She was a woman who had spent her life in the shadows, cleaning up other people's messes, making herself invisible. To suddenly be thrust into the spotlight, to be the center of attention of a man like Harrison Blackwood, was a terrifying experience. It's all right, sir, she murmured, her voice barely audible. As long as you're safe. No, Harrison said, shaking his head. It's not all right. I never knew. About you, about Abigail. Joe he never mentioned. He was a private man, Susan said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. He didn't like to mix his worlds. His life in the service, and his life at home. They were two different things. But he talked about me? Harrison asked, a strange note of hope in his voice. All the time, Abigail piped up, her voice a little stronger now. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew. Except for him, of course. A small smile touched Harrison's lips. That sounded like Joe. proud, confident, with a dry wit that could cut through any tension. He missed him, more than he had ever realized. "He taught me everything I know," Harrison said, his voice soft. "How to read a map, how to survive in the wilderness, how to lead. He was more of a father to me than my own." He looked at Abigail, at her bright, intelligent eyes. "You have his courage, you know that." Abigail blushed, a faint pink spreading across her cheeks. "I was just scared," she admitted. "I heard them talking. Two men, in the hallway. They were whispering about your car, about the brakes. I didn't know what to do, so I ran." Harrison's blood ran cold. "You saw them?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Can you describe them?" Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, trying to remember. "They were wearing maintenance uniforms," she said. "But they didn't look like janitors. Their shoes, they were too clean. And they had little wires in their ears. Earpieces. Professional security. Not your average disgruntled employees. This was a conspiracy, carefully planned and executed. And they had almost succeeded." "Thompson," Harrison said, his voice a low growl. "Get the security footage from the service corridors. I want every frame from the last 24 hours analyzed. And give me a list of every maintenance worker in this building. I want to know who they are, where they live, and who they work for." "Right away, sir," Thompson said, his voice grim. He knew, as well as Harrison did, that this was just the beginning. The enemy had shown their hand. Now, it was Harrison's turn to play. He turned his attention back to Susan and Abigail. "You two can't go home," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's not safe. You'll stay here, in the guest suite. Thompson will arrange for a security detail." Susan opened her mouth to protest, but Harrison held up a hand. "Please," he said, his voice softening. "Let me do this. For Joe. For me." Susan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She knew he was right. They were in danger now, all of them. And Harrison Blackwood's penthouse, with its state-of-the-art security and team of trained professionals, was the safest place in the city. Later that evening, after Susan and Abigail were settled in the guest suite, Harrison sat alone in his office, the city lights twinkling below him like a sea of fallen stars. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, but he wasn't drinking. He was thinking about the past, the present, and the uncertain future. He thought about Joe, about the lessons he had taught him. "The measure of a man is not what he has," Joe used to say, "but what he does with what he has." Harrison had a lot. Power, wealth, influence. But what had he done with it? He had built an empire, yes, but he had also built a fortress around his heart. He had shut himself off from the world, from human connection, from the very things that Joe had held most dear. Family, loyalty, love. He looked at the photo on his desk again. The smiling faces of two young men, full of hope and promise. He had let that man down, he realized. The man who had saved his life, the man who had believed in him. He had become so consumed with the pursuit of success that he had forgotten what it truly meant to be successful. But it wasn't too late. He had been given a second chance. A chance to make things right. A chance to be the man that Joseph Miller had always known he could be. And he would not waste it. He would find the men who had tried to kill him. He would uncover the truth behind the conspiracy. And he would protect the family of his friend, his mentor, his hero, no matter what the cost. The first step was to understand the enemy. Harrison pulled up the files on the merger. It was a hostile takeover of a rival corporation, a company run by a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a ruthless, ambitious man, known for his cutthroat tactics and his disregard for the rules. He was also a man who stood to lose everything if the merger went through. Harrison had always known that Thorne was a snake, but he had underestimated just how venomous he could be. He spent the rest of the night digging into Thorne's background, his business dealings, his known associates. He created a web of connections, a map of Thorne's world. And the more he learned, the more certain he became that Thorne was behind the attempt on his life. But certainty wasn't enough. He needed proof. Hard, irrefutable proof. And he knew just where to find it. The next morning, Harrison called a meeting with his top legal and security teams. He laid out his suspicions, his evidence, his plan. There were murmurs of shock and disbelief. But no one questioned his authority. They had seen the look in his eyes. The cold, hard resolve of a man who had been pushed too far. "I want a full-court press on Thorne," Harrison said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I want to know everything. His finances, his communications, his movements. I want to know what he had for breakfast. I want to know who he's sleeping with. I want to know where he buries his bodies. And I want it all yesterday." The team scrambled to obey, a flurry of activity and hushed, urgent conversations. Harrison watched them for a moment, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. He was back in his element. The hunt was on. He then did something he hadn't done in years. He cleared his schedule for the rest of the day. He told his assistant to cancel his meetings, to hold his calls. He had something more important to do. He went to the guest suite and knocked on the door. Susan opened it, her face still etched with worry. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Everything is under control," Harrison said, a faint smile on his lips. I was wondering if Abigail would like to see the city." A few minutes later, Harrison, Abigail, and Susan were on the roof of the building, a private helipad with a breathtaking view of the city. Abigail's eyes were wide with wonder. She had never been this high up before. She had never seen the world from this perspective. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "Yes," Harrison said, his eyes not on the city, but on the small girl by his side. "It is." They spent the next hour on the roof, talking. Harrison told Abigail stories about her grandfather, about their adventures in the desert. He told her about the time Joe had wrestled a snake, the time he had navigated them through a sandstorm, the time he had shared his last canteen of water with a wounded enemy soldier. He told her about her grandfather's courage, his kindness, his unwavering sense of honor. And as he spoke, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The weight of loneliness, of regret, of a life lived in the shadows of his own success. He was connecting with someone again. He was sharing a part of himself that he had kept hidden for too long. He was feeling human. "He sounds like a superhero," Abigail said, her eyes shining. "He was," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was a real-life superhero." He looked at Susan, and for the first time, he saw not just his maid, but a woman of quiet strength and dignity. A woman who had raised a remarkable daughter on her own. A woman who was the living legacy of his best friend. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. "For not knowing. For not being there." Susan just smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "You're here now," she said. "That's all that matters." And in that moment, Harrison Blackwood knew that she was right. He was here now, and he wasn't going anywhere. He had a promise to keep, a debt to repay, a family to protect, and a war to win. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt ready for the fight. He had something to fight for again, and that made all the difference in the world. The next few days settled into a strange new rhythm. The penthouse, once a sterile monument to Harrison's success, became a home. The quiet hum of servers and the distant city traffic were now punctuated by the sound of Abigail's laughter, the scent of Susan's home-cooked meals, and the low murmur of conversation in the evenings. For Harrison, it was like stepping into a different life, a life he had only ever observed from a distance. He found himself looking forward to the end of the workday, not for the solitude and the silence, but for the company. He learned that Abigail was a voracious reader, her mind a sponge for stories and facts. He gave her free rein of his library, a collection of first editions and rare manuscripts that he had acquired more for their value than for their content. But seeing them through her eyes, watching her carefully turn the fragile pages with a reverence that bordered on awe, he felt a renewed appreciation for the worlds they contained. He found himself reading again, not just market reports and legal briefs, but novels, histories, biographies. He and Abigail would talk for hours about the characters they loved, the battles they had witnessed, the lessons they had learned. He learned, too, that Susan was more than just a quiet, efficient maid. She was a woman of deep resilience and quiet wisdom. She had raised Abigail on her own, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, never complaining, never losing hope. She spoke of her father with a fierce, protective love, sharing stories of his kindness, his integrity, his unwavering moral compass. Through her, Harrison saw a side of Joe Miller that he had never known. The soldier, the hero, was also a father, a grandfather, a man who found joy in the simple things, a well-tended garden, a perfectly grilled steak, the sound of his granddaughter's laughter. This newfound domesticity, however, was a fragile bubble in the midst of a gathering storm. The investigation into Marcus Thorne was proceeding at a relentless pace. Harrison's team, a hand-picked group of the best investigators, analysts, and security experts money could buy, was a well-oiled machine. They worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and a fierce loyalty to the man who had always treated them with respect and rewarded their efforts generously. The first breakthrough came from the security footage. After hours of painstaking analysis, they found it. A grainy, low-resolution image of two men in maintenance uniforms, their faces partially obscured by shadows and the angle of the camera. But it was enough. Facial recognition software, cross-referenced with employee records and criminal databases, came back with a match. Two names. Both ex-military, both with specialized training in explosives and demolitions. And both with a documented history of working as freelance consultants for corporations engaged in hostile takeovers. The connection to Thorne was circumstantial, but it was a start. The second breakthrough came from the financials. A deep dive into Thorne's offshore accounts revealed a series of complex, layered transactions designed to be untraceable. But Harrison's team was better than good. They were the best. They peeled back the layers one by one, following the money trail across continents and through a labyrinth of shell corporations. And at the end of the trail, they found it. A payment of $200,000 made to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands, an account linked to one of the two men from the security footage. The payment was made 3 days before the attempt on Harrison's life. It was the smoking gun. Or at least, it was close enough. Harrison now had the means to put pressure on Thorne, to squeeze him, to make him sweat. He could go to the authorities, of course, but that wasn't his style. The legal system was slow, cumbersome, unpredictable. He preferred to operate on his own terms, in his own arena. He would confront Thorne himself. He would look him in the eye and watch him squirm. He would enjoy the moment of victory, the satisfaction of seeing his enemy brought low. But as he prepared for the confrontation, a seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind. Was this really about victory? About revenge? Or was it about something more? He thought of Abigail, of her innocent, trusting eyes. He thought of Susan, of her quiet strength and unwavering decency. He thought of Joe, of the man who had taught him that true strength was not in the ability to crush your enemies, but in the ability to protect the innocent. He realized, with a jolt of surprise, that he didn't want to be the man who enjoyed watching his enemy squirm. He didn't want to be the man who reveled in the destruction of another. He wanted to be the man that Abigail and Susan saw when they looked at him. The man that Joe had always believed him to be. A good man. An honorable man. A man who fought not for personal gain, but for what was right. This realization changed everything. His strategy shifted. It was no longer about a personal vendetta against Marcus Thorne. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that Thorne could never again harm another innocent person. And to do that, he needed more than just a financial trail and a grainy security photo. He needed a confession. He needed Thorne to admit what he had done, to expose the rot at the core of his own corporation. And he knew just how to get it. The plan was audacious, risky, and bordered on the illegal. It involved a carefully orchestrated leak of information, a staged confrontation, and a high-stakes game of psychological warfare. It was a plan that could easily backfire, that could land Harrison himself in a world of legal trouble. But he didn't hesitate. He had spent his life taking calculated risks. And this was one risk he was willing to take. He summoned his head of security, a former MI6 agent named Reynolds, a man who specialized in the art of persuasion and information extraction. Together, they went over the plan, refining the details, anticipating every possible contingency. They assembled a team, a small, elite unit of specialists who would carry out the operation with precision and discretion. The first step was to lure Thorne into a trap. Harrison arranged for a private meeting, ostensibly to discuss a possible settlement of the merger. He knew Thorne would be suspicious, but he also knew that Thorne's ego wouldn't allow him to refuse. The prospect of a face-to-face confrontation with his rival, the chance to gloat, to probe for weakness, would be too tempting to resist. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a private club in a discreet, upscale neighborhood. The room was swept for bugs, the security was tight, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Harrison arrived first, calm and composed, his face a mask of cool indifference. Thorne arrived a few minutes later, swaggering and self-assured, a smug smile on his face. "Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Thorne," Harrison replied, his voice flat and even. "Cut the crap. We both know why we're here." He gestured to a chair. "Sit down. We have a lot to talk about." Thorne's smile faltered for a moment. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a negotiation, a dance of words and veiled threats. He hadn't expected this raw, undisguised aggression. He hesitated for a moment, then sat, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Harrison leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I know it was you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "I know you hired the men who tampered with my car. I know you paid them. I know everything." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're insane," he said. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Harrison said, a cold smile on his lips. He slid a folder across the table. It contained a single sheet of paper, a printout of the transaction record from the offshore account. Thorne glanced at it, his face turning pale. He tried to maintain his composure, to bluff his way through, but his hands were trembling. "This proves nothing," he stammered. "It's a forgery, a fabrication." "Is it?" Harrison asked, his voice soft and silky. "Then you won't mind if I share it with the SEC, and the FBI, and the New York Times. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your creative accounting." Thorne's bravado crumbled. The fear in his eyes was real now. He was a cornered animal, lashing out in a desperate attempt to survive. "You can't do this," he hissed. "I'll ruin you. I'll drag your name through the mud. I'll expose every dirty little secret you have." Harrison just smiled. "You're welcome to try," he said. "But you see, Thorne, there's a difference between you and me. My secrets are just business. Yours are criminal. And I have the proof." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Thorne's face. "But I'm a reasonable man," he said. "I'm willing to make you an offer." Thorne looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "What kind of offer?" "You will withdraw your opposition to the merger," Harrison said, his voice cold and hard. "You will sell me your shares at a fair market price. You will resign from your position as CEO, and you will disappear. You will move to a small, quiet island somewhere, and you will never, ever show your face in this city again." Thorne stared at him, his mouth agape. You're letting me go?" "I'm giving you a choice," Harrison said. "You can take my offer, or you can take your chances with the legal system. But I assure you, if you choose the latter, you will spend the rest of your life in a very small, very unpleasant room. The choice is yours." Thorne sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the color draining from his face. He looked at the folder on the table, at the cold, hard eyes of the man across from him. He had been beaten, utterly and completely. He had no cards left to play. He had no way out. He had no choice. "I'll take the offer," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Harrison nodded, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. He had won. He had defeated his enemy, not with violence, not with brute force, but with intelligence, with strategy, with a deeper understanding of the man he was up against. He had used Thorne's own greed, his own ego, his own fear against him. He had played the game, and he had played it better. But as he watched Thorne sign the papers, his hand trembling, his face a mask of defeat, Harrison felt no joy, no triumph, only a profound sense of emptiness. This was the world he had created for himself, a world of power plays and backroom deals, of winners and losers, of predators and prey, a world where men like Marcus Thorne could thrive, where innocent lives were just collateral damage in the relentless pursuit of profit. He had won the battle, but he had lost something far more important along the way, his own humanity. And as he walked out of the club, leaving the wreckage of Marcus Thorne's life behind him, he knew that his real fight was just beginning. The fight to reclaim his soul. The fight to become the man he was always meant to be. The fight to be worthy of the trust, the love, the second chance that had been so unexpectedly, so miraculously, given to him. He returned to the penthouse to find Abigail and Susan in the kitchen, baking cookies. The warm, sweet smell of chocolate and vanilla filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of the club. Abigail, her face smudged with flour, ran to him and threw her arms around his legs. "We saved you one," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. Harrison looked down at the small, happy girl, at her innocent, trusting face. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a genuine, unadulterated sense of joy. He scooped her up in his arms, holding her close. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the best cookie I've ever had." And as he stood there, in the warm, bright kitchen, with the smell of cookies in the air and the weight of a small, trusting child in his arms, he knew that he was home. He had found his way back from the brink. He had been given a second chance, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve it. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. He had many bridges to mend, many wrongs to right. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, a sense of peace. The war was over. The battle for his soul had just begun, and he was ready for the fight. The days that followed were a period of deceptive calm. With Marcus Thorne gone, a quiet efficiency settled back over Harrison's corporate life. The merger proceeded smoothly, his board was pleased, and the stock market rewarded his victory with a satisfying surge. But for Harrison, the thrill of the win was gone, replaced by a different, more profound kind of satisfaction. He found it not in the boardroom, but in the small, ordinary moments that now defined his evenings. He would come home to the smell of dinner cooking, a sound of Abby practicing her violin, a new gift from him, and the quiet, calming presence of Susan. They would eat together at the large mahogany dining table, a table that had previously only been used for formal, sterile business dinners. Now, it was a place of shared stories and laughter. Harrison would help Abby with her math homework, marveling at the quick, sharp intelligence she had inherited from her grandfather. He would talk with Susan late into the evening, sharing memories of Joe, learning more about the man who had shaped both their lives in such different ways. He started making changes at work, small at first, then more significant. He implemented a new employee wellness program, increased the company's contribution to their retirement plans, and established a generous scholarship fund for the children of his employees. He vetoed a planned factory closure that would have devastated a small town, instead investing in modernizing the facility and retraining the workforce. His CFO was baffled, his board skeptical. "It's not the most profitable move," Harrison, his second-in-command, a shrewd man named David Chun, had warned. "Profit isn't the only metric we should be measuring," Harrison had replied, his voice calm but firm. "We're building a company, David, not just a stock price. We need to build it on a foundation of something more than just concrete and steel." He was trying to build a legacy that Joe Miller would have been proud of. He established the Joseph Miller Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. At the launch event, with Susan and Abigail by his side, he spoke not of balance sheets and market shares, but of honor, integrity, and service. He spoke of Joe, and as he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a sense of purpose that all his billions had never been able to buy. But in the quiet moments, late at night when the city slept below him, a nagging unease persisted. The victory over Thorne had been too easy, too clean. Thorne was a snake, yes, but he was a cautious one. Sabotaging the car of a man like Harrison Blackwood was an extreme, almost reckless move. It felt desperate, and Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing a piece of the puzzle. His security chief, Reynolds, felt it too. "We've been interrogating the two men we picked up," Reynolds told him one afternoon in his office. "The ones who did the job on your car. They're professionals, tight-lipped, but they let something slip." Harrison leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What did they say?" "They confirmed Thorne hired them, but they mentioned their handler. The man who gave them the specific instructions wasn't Thorne. It was someone else, someone they were clearly more afraid of than him." "Did they give you a name?" "No, just a description. An older man, very distinguished, quiet. Walks with a slight limp." A chill snaked its way down Harrison's spine. A limp. He knew many men who fit that description. It was a common legacy of a life in the service. But one man came to mind immediately, a man he hadn't seen in years. A man he had once trusted implicitly, General Morrison, Joe Miller's former commanding officer, and a man who now sat on the board of a major defense contractor, a company Harrison's own was in negotiations with for a separate, highly sensitive project. It seemed impossible. Morrison was a decorated hero, a pillar of the military community, a man Joe had respected. "It could be anyone," Harrison said, more to himself than to Reynolds. "Perhaps," Reynolds conceded. "But there's something else." When they were cleaning out Thorne's office, my team found this." He slid a small, tarnished silver locket across the desk. It was old, intricately engraved with the image of a soaring eagle. Harrison picked it up. It felt heavy in his hand, weighted with a history he didn't understand. He opened it. Inside, there were two miniature, faded photographs. On one side was a young woman with a sad, beautiful smile. On the other was a young Joseph Miller in full dress uniform. "Where did Thorne get this?" Harrison asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We don't know," Reynolds said. "It was hidden in a secret compartment in his desk. It seems personal." Harrison stared at the locket, his mind reeling. Joe had never mentioned this woman. He had never spoken of a locket. This was a piece of his mentor's life that had been deliberately kept hidden, and Marcus Thorne had possessed it. Why? What was the connection? The merger, the sabotage, the mysterious handler. It was all connected. He was sure of it. And somehow, at the center of it all, was his friend, Joseph Miller. That evening, he approached Susan with a heavy heart. He found her in the library, reading a book, a soft smile on her face. Abigail was asleep, her homework spread out on the table beside her. "Susan," he began, his voice hesitant. "I need to ask you something. About your father." He showed her the locket. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then dawning recognition. I've never seen this before," she said, her voice trembling as she took the locket from his hand. She stared at the photo of the young woman, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But this woman, she looks familiar. I think I saw a picture of her once, a long time ago. In my father's things. Do you know who she is?" Susan shook her head. "No, he never spoke of her. But there was a box. A small wooden box he kept in the back of his closet. He told me never to open it. He said it was from his time in the service, and that some things were better left in the past." A jolt of adrenaline shot through Harrison. "Susan, is there any chance you still have that box?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, it's in storage. I never had the heart to throw it away." 2 hours later, a dusty, worn wooden box sat on Harrison's desk. It was a simple footlocker military issue with the name Miller J. stenciled in faded white paint on the side. The lock was old and rusted, but it opened with a protesting squeak. Together, Harrison and Susan began to sort through the contents. It was a time capsule of a young man's life. Bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. A worn leather-bound journal. A purple heart and a silver star nestled in a velvet case. And at the bottom of the box, a collection of old, black-and-white photographs. They spread the photos out on the desk. Pictures of a young Joe Miller grinning with his comrades in arms. Pictures of dusty, war-torn landscapes. And then, they found her, the woman from the locket. She was in several of the photos, always by Joe's side. They were laughing, holding hands, looking at each other with an unmistakable love in their eyes. In one photo, she was holding a small baby. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's my mother's locket," she whispered, pointing to a delicate silver chain around the woman's neck. "The one she was wearing in the only baby picture I have of her." Harrison felt the air leave the room. He looked from the photo of the woman, to the photo of Joe, to the face of Susan, who stood beside him, her eyes wide with a dawning, impossible truth. "Susan," he said, his voice barely audible. "The woman in this picture is your mother?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But that's impossible. My father told me my mother died in a car accident when I was a baby. He said he was the only one there." Harrison picked up the leather-bound journal. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first page was dated nearly 40 years ago. The handwriting was Joe's, neat and precise, the script of a man who understood the importance of detail. He began to read aloud. October 12th. Her name is Elena. She has eyes the color of the sky after a storm, and a smile that could disarm a battalion. I met her in the village today. They say she is a spy. I say she is an angel." He continued to read, his voice growing heavier with each word. The journal told a story of a forbidden love, a secret romance between an American soldier and a local woman in a war-torn country. It told of a secret marriage, of a child born in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. It told of a mission gone wrong, of a betrayal from within Joe's own unit. And then, the final, devastating entry. They took her. Morrison gave the order, said she was a liability, a threat to national security. He said they were taking her to a safe house, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was lying. They were going to make her disappear. I tried to stop them, but they were too many. I was just a sergeant. He was a general. I had no choice. I had to save our daughter. I had to run. I told everyone Elena died in an accident. It was the only way to protect our child. The only way to keep her safe from the men who would use her to silence me. I have failed the woman I love. I will not fail my daughter. Harrison looked up from the journal, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The shocking truth was not that Marcus Thorne had tried to kill him. It was that the man he had idolized, the hero he had worshipped, had built his life on a foundation of lies. And that the man who had orchestrated it all, the man with the quiet voice and the slight limp, was not just a business rival, but a monster who had torn a family apart and buried the truth for 40 years. General Morrison. The attempt on Harrison's life hadn't been about the merger. It had been a warning. He was getting too close to the truth. The defense contract negotiations, his renewed interest in Joe's past after meeting Abigail. Morrison had seen him as a threat, a loose end that needed to be tied up. And Thorne, with his own grudge, had been the perfect pawn. He looked at Susan, who was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands. He looked at the pictures of the young, vibrant woman who had been stolen from her life. He looked at the face of his friend, his mentor, a man who had lived a life of quiet torment, haunted by a secret he could never share. The anger that rose in Harrison was a white-hot inferno. It was an anger born not of a threat to his business, but of a profound sense of betrayal. A betrayal of friendship, of loyalty, of the very code of honor that Joe and he had lived by. He knew what he had to do. This was no longer about business. This was about justice. Justice for Elena, justice for Susan, and justice for the memory of his friend, Joseph Miller. He would not let Morrison get away with it. He would expose him, no matter what the cost. He would tear down the walls of secrecy and lies, and he would let the truth, however painful, finally see the light of day. The war he thought was over had just begun, and this time it was personal. The silence in the penthouse was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. The city lights outside seemed distant, cold stars in a galaxy far removed from the raw, human tragedy that had just unfolded within Harrison's walls. Susan had stopped crying, her grief having subsided into a state of numb shock. She sat staring at the photograph of her mother, her fingers tracing the outline of a face she had never known, a life she had never been allowed to mourn. Harrison's own grief was a sharp, cold knot in his stomach. But beneath it, the anger was building, a controlled, volcanic pressure. This wasn't the hot, impulsive rage he had felt towards Thorne. This was something deeper, colder, more absolute. It was the righteous fury of a man who had seen a profound injustice, a desecration of everything he held sacred. He had idolized Joe Miller, not just as a mentor, but as a paragon of virtue. To discover that this hero had lived a life of such profound sorrow and sacrifice, all because of the craven betrayal of a man he trusted, was a wound that cut to the very core of Harrison's being. He looked at the journal, at the silver star, at the tangible proof of a life of honor lived under the shadow of an unbearable lie. Morrison hadn't just taken Elena's life. He had stolen Joe's peace, Susan's history, and a future that should have been filled with love and family. He had twisted a story of heroism into a tragedy of secrets and lies. And he had done it all from behind a carefully constructed facade of respectability and patriotism. Reynolds, Harrison spoke into his phone, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was barely a whisper. Get back here, now, and bring everything you have on General Robert Morrison. He knelt before Susan, his movements slow, deliberate. He gently took her hand. It was cold as ice. Susan, he said, his voice soft but filled with an unshakable conviction. I am going to fix this. I am going to find out what happened to your mother. And I am going to make the man responsible pay for what he has done. I swear this to you, on your father's memory. She looked at him, her eyes vacant with shock, but she nodded, a single, silent tear tracing a path down her cheek. She was clinging to his words, a lifeline in the wreckage of her past. When Reynolds arrived, Harrison laid it all out. The journal, the photographs, the locket, the story of a forbidden love, a secret child, and a 40-year-old crime. Reynolds, A man who had seen the worst of humanity in his years with MI6, listened in grim silence, his face an unreadable mask. When Harrison was finished, the only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "This is explosive," Reynolds said, his voice a low murmur. "Morrison is more than just a retired general. He's a legend. He sits on the boards of half a dozen of the most powerful corporations in the country. He has friends in the Pentagon, in the Senate, in the intelligence community. To go after him is to go after the establishment itself." "I don't care," Harrison said, his voice flat and cold. "He's a murderer and a traitor to every value he pretends to uphold. He's not a legend. He's a cancer." "I agree," Reynolds said. "But we can't fight this war in the open. A direct assault would be suicide. He would bury us in litigation, in negative press, in a storm of political and public backlash. He would paint you as a disgruntled corporate raider with a personal vendetta. He would discredit Joe's journal, call him a delusional, lovesick soldier. He would destroy us before we ever got near the truth." "So what do you suggest?" Harrison asked, his jaw tight. "We fight him in the shadows," Reynolds replied, his eyes glinting with a cold, professional light. "The same way he operates. We don't go after the legend. We go after the man. We find the cracks in his armor. We find his other secrets, his other crimes. Because a man who could do this," he gestured to the journal, "has done other things. Men like Morrison don't just have one skeleton in their closet. They have a graveyard." The new war began that night. It was a war fought not with soldiers and guns, but with data and whispers, with encrypted files and discreet inquiries. Harrison's penthouse became a command center. A team of the world's best digital investigators, hackers, analysts, forensic accountants, was assembled, working in a secure, isolated network. Their target, General Robert Morrison. Their mission, to dismantle his life, piece by piece, until the truth was all that remained. While the digital team hunted for ghosts in the machine, Reynolds activated his network of human assets. Former spies, grizzled journalists, retired military officers who had grown disillusioned with the system. They began to quietly ask questions, to pull on the loose threads of Morrison's long and storied career. They were searching for anyone who might have served with Joe and Morrison, anyone who might have known Elena, anyone who might have heard the rumors that must have followed such a dark and secret event. The first few weeks were slow, frustrating. Morrison's life was a fortress of carefully constructed lies. His official record was pristine, his finances impenetrable, his reputation unassailable. But Harrison was patient. He knew that every fortress had a weakness. It was just a matter of finding it. During this time, life in the penthouse continued its surreal rhythm. To protect Susan and Abigail, Harrison tightened security, creating a gilded cage around them. He knew that if Morrison even suspected what they were doing, he would not hesitate to eliminate the last living link to his crime. Susan, slowly emerging from her shock, began to read her father's journal, weeping for the parents she never knew, and for the father who had carried such a heavy burden alone. Abigail, shielded from the darkest parts of the truth, knew only that they were in danger and that Harrison was protecting them. She clung to him, her unwavering trust a constant, painful reminder of what was at stake. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unexpected source. One of Reynolds' contacts, an old, semi-retired journalist living in obscurity in rural Virginia, remembered the name. Elena. He had been a young reporter, embedded with Morrison's unit 40 years ago. He had heard rumors of a local woman, a suspected informant, who had disappeared. The official story was that she had been killed by enemy forces. But the journalist had always had his doubts. He remembered the look on the young Sergeant Miller's face in the days that followed. A look of haunted, impotent rage. The journalist had a source, another soldier from that unit who had always been troubled by the official story. A man named Peterson, who now lived a quiet life in a small town in Arizona. Reynolds flew to Arizona himself. He found Peterson, a man now in his late 60s, his face weathered by the sun and a lifetime of hard memories. At first, Peterson was reluctant to talk. He was afraid. Morrison was a powerful man, even after all these years. But Reynolds was persuasive. He spoke of justice, of honoring a fallen comrade's memory. And he showed him a picture of Susan and Abigail. That was what broke him. The sight of Joe Miller's daughter and granddaughter, the living proof of the secret he had helped to bury. Peterson's story came tumbling out, a torrent of guilt and regret that had been dammed up for 40 years. He had been there that night. He had been one of the men ordered by Morrison to take Elena. He confirmed everything in the journal. Morrison had been obsessed with her, jealous of her love for Joe. He had used her suspected status as an informant as an excuse. It wasn't an official military operation. It was a kidnapping, an assassination. We took her to an abandoned farmhouse a few miles from the base. Peterson confessed, his voice thick with shame. Morrison was waiting for us. He interrogated her himself. He wanted to know what she had told the enemy. But she knew nothing. She was just a girl in love with a soldier. When she wouldn't give him the answers he wanted, he lost control. Peterson's voice broke. He killed her, he whispered. In cold blood. Then he made us bury her in the woods. He told us that if we ever spoke a word of it, we would be charged with treason and executed. He said Sergeant Miller was a traitor for consorting with the enemy, and that he was lucky to be alive. We were young. We were scared. We did what we were told. But Peterson had done one more thing. A small act of rebellion, of conscience. Before they filled in the grave, he had taken a small, unique button that had fallen from Elena's coat. A keepsake. A piece of proof. He had kept it hidden all these years, a dark talisman of his own cowardice. He gave it to Reynolds. When Reynolds returned to New York and presented the evidence, a grim silence fell over the command center. They now had a witness. They had a confession. They had the physical evidence of the button. They had enough to go to the authorities. But Harrison knew it still wasn't enough. Morrison would fight back. He would discredit Peterson, claim he was a disgruntled, delusional old man. He would use his power and influence to bury the story, just as he had buried Elena's body 40 years ago. No, Harrison needed something more. He needed to confront the monster himself. He needed to look him in the eye and see him for what he was. He needed a confession from Morrison's own lips. And he had a plan. A dangerous, high-stakes gamble that would put all of them in the crosshairs. He would use the defense contract negotiations as a pretext. He would arrange a private meeting with Morrison, just the two of them. And he would set a trap, a carefully orchestrated conversation designed to appeal to Morrison's arrogance, his pride, his unshakable belief in his own impunity. The entire conversation would be recorded, every word, every nuance. It was a long shot, a desperate play, but it was the only way to get the justice that Joe, Elena, and Susan deserved. The only way to finally, after 40 long years, bring the truth to light. The final battle was about to begin. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you enjoyed this one, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.